couple more folks join us. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on CORES recertification. I'm Alexandra Nassau-Brownstone, Vice President of Resident Outcomes and CORES at Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, or SAFE. We're the organization that operates the CORES program. So we're pleased to have you all with us today to learn a little bit about the recertification process. Couple of housekeeping notes, which is also in the chat. But you should have received a notification. We are recording today's session. It will be made available after today so that you can go back and reference information that was discussed in the presentation and Q&A session. We will also make all the slides that you're going to see today. Those will be public as well, so you can go back and reference those. And we have sort of a more formal presentation of slides, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions, you feel free to put them in the chat. We may wait till the very end to come through and make sure that we're addressing all the questions that were asked. So without further ado, we can get going. I think for most of you on today's call, you have some familiarity with CORES, the Certified Organization for Resident Engagement and Services Certification, though some of you may be taking on a new role in your organization and are getting familiar with CORES. So we're not going to do a deep dive into the CORES 101. There's a webinar that's available that's going to answer a lot of those questions. We'll share links to that. But we'll touch on a couple of things that obviously apply both to the initial CORES certification and to the recertification. So just very fundamentally, want to remind folks, especially if you're new to it, that CORES is a certification, an organizational level certification, and it recognizes owner-operators or third parties that have developed this really deep commitment and capacity and competency in providing resident services coordination within the setting of affordable rental homes. And for those of you who participated in the sort of first round of certification, this should look really familiar. These are the initial goals, these objectives that we'd identified when we launched CORES back in 2018. And really it was driven with a desire to establish a common language and common understanding and standards for the field, to help support and improve and build stronger resident services operations and help organizations communicate those structures and those processes externally with funders and investors and other partners, engage with policymakers. And also we heard quite a bit that it helps organizations to communicate and solidify some of those internally. A big piece of this when we started out was to help support and attract new funding sources for, creating stable sources of funding for resident services. And we continue to really push to demonstrate the impact of stable, affordable housing that's enriched with services. So the recertification builds on that. And at base, it's a process that's looking to ensure that a certified organization continues to meet the same CORES requirements and is maintaining that robust and strategic approach to resident services that you've built, that is both scaled in the places in your portfolio where you're doing resident services, but it is also person-centered and thinking about what are the unique conditions and priorities that have been identified in the communities where you're working. The other piece of this is that as we were building this recertification process, we wanted to recognize that the resident services field is constantly evolving, and that we would expect an organization's portfolio and their business model and their infrastructure and practice, they're going to evolve in 5 years. And I would say particularly in the last 5 years that we've all come through, we would expect to see evolution and change and rethinking. And so the certification or recertification is built to inquire about that and to give an applicant an opportunity to reflect changes. The initial certification was built on a framework for a system of resident services coordination. Again, this should be very familiar, but for those of you who may not have engaged in CORES for quite a while or taking over, it would be helpful if you haven't yet had an opportunity to take a look at this tool. This is the graphic element of the tool, but there's a set of companion guidelines. CORES was built off of this framework, and this framework grew out of a community of practice back in 2015 to 2018, which SAFE facilitated, and it was really digging into how organizations think about, build, and operationalize their resident services infrastructure in a way that can be replicated and scaled, but is also person-centered. And so we're not going to dig into any of the details of this in today's webinar. We're just flagging this. There are resources that we'll share in the chat and on the website that you can spend a little time with if this is something that's new to you. So very high level, the recertification is just like the original certification in that it's evaluating organizational level capacity. It's certifying the organization and not a specific property. While we do ask for examples from specific properties in your portfolio, and there's sometimes confusion about that, it is again an organizational level process. And it, just like the original certification, it will last for 5 years. Recertification is required every 5 years to maintain it. If your organization is using CORES to qualify for some kind of financing, right now the most common example of that would be if you're using it for Fannie Mae's Healthy Housing Rewards Enhanced Resident Services financing, or if you've used it to qualify and earn points in a low-income housing tax credit QAP process, and you've indicated that you're CORES certified, and that helped you to gain those points and or get that financing, the expectation is that you are maintaining this recertification at least for the life of that financing and potentially beyond. As I've already touched on, this recertification is built to, to recognize that a standard continues to be met and that the organization is maintaining that standard, but it also really looks to see how an organization is reflecting on what's changed and what's evolved. As I said, we can't imagine a scenario where there's an organization that was certified 5 years ago where something hasn't evolved. The last piece that I want to cover here is the timing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we get further in, but we recommend that an organization begin the process of recertifying no later than 3 months in advance of the date that their certification is expiring. And that's really to ensure that your team has enough time to put the application together and pull the supplemental or additional documents and uploads together, that our team has the time to review it. As with the initial certification program, there is an opportunity if an application comes in and we need some update to be made, we would ask the organization to update it. So this is trying to create enough time so that if you're in a position where we need to ask you for an update, there's the time to do that and for you to get it back into us so we can get it scored and then advance to an external peer review committee. So we'll go into a little bit more on that, but at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mina Nutbeam, who's going to talk us all through the nuts and bolts of the recertification.
Thanks, Alexandra, and hi, everyone. Okay, so we're going to start here just with a brief overview of the 3 CORES models. So similar to certification, we have these 3 service models, which we have listed here for reference, and you should be recertifying under the same model that you were initially CORES certified in. So that will be one of these 3 models, either the direct model, the hybrid model, or the third-party model. And if you are certified under more than one model, you will be recertifying for each model separately, as you did for initial certification. Again, if you need a refresher on these, please review the CORES 101 webinar, which we shared a link to in the chat. So once you complete your recertification pre-screen application, that's where we'll ask you about any changes to your current service model. And if your model has changed, we'll reach out to you to have a conversation to understand those changes and best next steps for recertification. Now let's get into a bit more information about the recertification process. Next slide, thank you. So CORES recertification. So these questions are going to be very similar in format as the initial certification. However, you may see that there are less questions than the original certification, which was around 50 to 55 questions, depending on the model you were certified under. So recertification is closer to 40 questions. Another change about recertification is that we now have 10 threshold requirements where previously there were 9. So there's been the addition of 1 threshold from initial certification, And this requirement is that you have an executed MOU or formal agreement, which was something that we requested in initial certification, but wasn't a requirement. It now is. And this is something we'll go into a little further on in the slides. Another thing to note is that there are also several new changes to the minimum scoring requirements that we have, including that you're using community data and that you're tracking impact or outcomes. So we'll get, again, more into this in the following slides, but wanted to highlight that here as well. And then finally, the cost to recertify remains the same as initial certification at $5,500. And there is a note here too around the 4 threshold documents that you were required at initial certification. We're going to talk a bit more about that, but you will also need to provide an up-to-date example of each of those documents and tools for 2 properties this round. And again, we're going to go into more detail on this. So just to dig in on what are those, excuse me, what are those 9 CORES threshold requirements? So these requirements are for initial CORES certification, and they are also still required for recertification. Some of these should be very easy for you because you were able to achieve these with your initial certification. So you have to have 3 or more years of experience as a multifamily housing provider, or for the third-party model, 3 years of experience as a third-party provider, which you'll all get that one easy. That'll be an easy one for you guys. You must fit into one of the models, either direct, hybrid, or third-party. And then you must have 3 or more years of experience with resident services coordination. Again, that should be pretty easy for you all to achieve. 4th, you will be required to have resident services coordinator staff and coordination at more than 1 property. And you must have strategies for addressing low participation of residents. And then again, what was mentioned on the previous slide regarding the 4 threshold documents, we're now requiring 2 examples of each document instead of 1, which we'll discuss more. And those documents are the community scan, the resident opportunities and priorities assessment, property services plan, and resident indicators and analysis report. And we'll share a link to a webinar on the threshold documents as well in the chat if you're less familiar with those and need an additional refresher. Thanks, Alexandra. So here, just to provide a visual of this, because sometimes that can be helpful to folks, these again are the 4 key threshold documents, and I won't go into them in great detail, but you probably recall these from your initial certification. So the first document is the community scan, which looks at surrounding context and benchmarking to understand what resources and potential partners are available. And this is where you should be analyzing community level data, and this document should be updated at least once every 6 years. Then you have the resident opportunities and priorities assessment, which aggregates resident demographic information and feedback to really ground your services in resident-driven programming. And this is updated or required to be updated every 3 years. After that, you'll see the property services plan, which is pretty much your roadmap for what's supposed to be happening at the property and should be updated as well every 3 years. And finally, the resident indicators and analysis report, which is your opportunity really to assess how you're doing in relation to your property and organizational level goals. This is where you look at that impact and those outcomes. And because this is your sort of opportunity to assess and adapt programming, we require that this is updated annually. So again, we just discussed the timeframes for those. However, best practice, again, is to update these as regularly as possible, especially that resident opportunities and priorities assessment and property services plan. And now we're going to get into a bit more of the new requirements for this. So for each of these 4 property level tools that we just talked about, you're now required to upload an updated example of each tool from the initial CORES application property. So you selected 1 property in your initial application, and then uploaded a tool, each of those 4 tools for that one property. And then you are also, for recertification, required to upload an additional up-to-date example, or updated, I should say, example of each tool for an additional property in your portfolio. And if the property you used, I will say, in your initial application is no longer in your portfolio, we'll have a discussion with you about the best next steps. That's something we ask about in the pre-screen process, so that will be flagged there for us as well to talk about. And so that's the big requirement around the 4 threshold documents that we have, those property level tools. There are also some other new minimum requirements, which we're going to go over now. So one of these changes is around community data. So in your initial application, you use community data to inform your community scan. And for recertification, we're going to ask you to do the same thing. So you must be able to clearly articulate what types of community level data are considered and how community level data is used to inform and assist with your program and service planning. So this data could include a number of different types: census data, local school data, data from local government agencies, and other data that provides context and benchmarking for the broader community. And there is just a graphical representation of what we see included in that community scan. And of course, this should be including an assessment of that community level data as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so another new requirement for recertification. We're also changing the minimum scoring requirements for tracking impact and outcomes. So in your initial certification, you were asked to submit a resident indicators and analysis report, which included an analysis of the impact of services. And many times that included tracking outputs like participation in programming or the number of referrals. For recertification, we're also requiring that you be tracking outcomes, not only outputs. So this is something that you probably may have received a recommendation around if you weren't already tracking outcomes. And for recertification, this is going to be a requirement. So what's the difference between when we talk about outputs and outcomes? Next slide, please. So outputs, what are outputs? So outputs may include things like the types of programs or services being offered. You could be offering, financial stability programs or health and wellness programs, the intensity or duration of programs. How often are these being hosted? Is this a weekly program, a monthly program? Resident participation in those programs and engagement. So oftentimes this is tracked through attendance or the number of contacts with residents. And then the entity providing the program. So is this a community partner or is it a resident services coordinator really who's providing the program or service? However, outcomes go further to help you understand the actual impact of programming. Outcomes track resident change, well-being, or progress. They can be short-term, medium-term, or long-term. They can include resident satisfaction or perceptions of impact. And they can often assess different impact areas. So health or sense of security, resident agency, or economic mobility. And this is often determined both by your organizational goals as well as resident priorities. And they can also include indicators such as resident assets or lease violations or ER visits. So those are some things that outcomes include. And here we list some examples of outcome measures. These are just a few examples. And again, this will really be determined by your organizational priorities and resident priorities as well. We recommend that you consider registering for our upcoming webinar on February 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern, which is going to discuss some of the learnings from one of Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future's or SAFE's latest report on how organizations can track and evaluate outcomes. And again, thank you for linking that, Alexandra. So the link to register is there in the chat. And we'll send more information on this in our CORES newsletter as well. So that should be helpful to you all. And yes, there's the actual toolkit too. Thanks, Alexandra. So again, we understand that both outputs and outcomes tracking are important, which is why we're now requiring you to track both. Okay, and finally, we have a new threshold requirement, which I mentioned earlier for recertification, which should be familiar to you all. However, upon recertification, we're requiring you to upload an executed MOU or formal agreement with a partner organization from the last 3 years. So this should be an organization that's supporting resident services programming. This could be, a YMCA or food pantry, really a partner organization in services, but not a resident services contractor. And this agreement should consider the elements in this graphic here. So roles and responsibilities, participation expectations, outcomes, goals, insurance and liability information, as well as data sharing guidance if that's applicable to the partnership. And this agreement doesn't have to be, important to note that it doesn't have to be for the same properties that you include for your other property specific tool uploads that we talked about. However, this MOU is a requirement, again, for recertification. So now that we've discussed the new minimum requirements, let's discuss a bit more about additional changes you may notice in the recertification process. So you'll see that you'll be answering a similar set of questions, as I mentioned earlier, as recertification as you did for your initial application. However, some of the questions were removed because we felt like we didn't need additional information or updates. For example, we know certified organizations have at least 3 years of experience providing resident services. Many of the questions will be asking for an update to your answers in your original application with some updated wording to some questions for further clarification. And then finally, we'll also have several new questions that explore your evolution to meet the changing world and the different resident services practices in the field. A lot has happened since we originally launched CORES. Pandemic, a lot has changed. So we have some new questions to address these changes. So this could include questions on if and how you leverage virtual services, if you provide DEI training to resident services staff and others. Scoring. So here we have some information on the scoring process, and just want to note that this is an example of the direct model scoring here for recertification to show you what this may look like. It will vary a bit if you are applying under hybrid or third party. So the scoring process for recertification is fairly similar to our initial certification, while incorporating those additional minimum and threshold requirements we talked about. You're still required to meet a minimum number of points in each application section. So you see the different sections here, the portfolio profile, resident services coordination, utilizing information about residents and the community, etc. So you're still required to meet that minimum number of points for each section, as well as required to score a total of 40 points across your application. And this is the same as for initial certification. So you'll notice that the total points, when you actually add them up, if you're going through each section and trying to total those points, it's actually less than the 40-point minimum. And we did this intentionally, recognizing that organizations may exceed these minimum points in certain sections, especially where you have different strengths. So we have a minimum scoring of 40 points to account for that, which is, again, same as initial certification. So I think that's everything for that. So now more on what you should do to prepare for recertification. So it's very important that you review your last application and any written feedback that you received on areas for improvement or where you may have missed points. This is especially the case if you miss any items that we've been talking about that maybe you missed last time, but now these are minimum requirements. The MOU may be one example of that, where that's now a threshold requirement. So the recertification application will be submitted using a different portal link that will be made available soon on the CORES website, but you should still be using the same login information as for the initial CORES certification portal. If you're having trouble accessing the portal, please let us know. And you can find all the application questions once you log in there. And we've also included the recertification questions on the CORES website. So you can actually go to the CORES site and be able to see all of the recertifications for the direct and hybrid model at this moment in time. And you should begin working on your application. We're recommending at least 3 months in advance of the date your certification expires to ensure that you don't have any lapse in your certification. So what does the recertification review process look like? Next slide, please. Thank you. The recertification process and the review process is very similar to what you saw for the initial certification process. So again, you have that pre-screening. Once that is submitted, it is reviewed within 3 to 5 business days by our team. And we'll reach out to you if we have any questions or if there are any significant changes we would like to discuss with you. And once that is approved, you will be asked to pay the $5,500 application fee. And once that is paid, you'll receive access to the full recertification application. And once that application is submitted, we have our 4 to 6 week review period, which includes a staff review by 2 staff members, which provide a recommendation to the peer review committee. And then that peer review committee reviews and makes a final determination. And then again, for recertification, you'll be notified then if you are approved or denied for recertification. Again, all very similar to the process for certification. So this is going to be a bit more technical, and I'm not going to go through each of these slides, but we did want to go through navigating that recertification portal for you all. These slides, again, will be made available to you, so you'll be able to go back and look through if you have any questions. But this is what the portal login page will look like. So very similar to the CORES initial certification page. And again, you'll be logging in using the same information as your initial certification portal. So applicants will be able to access the original application in the CORES application portal. Just want to note that as well. We'll include a link to the CORES certification portal here too. So you should be able to toggle back and forth between those 2 portals if you want to view your previous answers in combination while you're completing your recertification. However, your answers won't be automatically copied and pasted. Given that so much has changed in the past 5 years, we're asking you to account for those changes in your answers. So first, you're going to click on Get Started, and that'll take you to a new application. And once you do that, you'll see that you're going to be able to click that Open button to complete your pre-screen form, which asks questions about any changes to your model, which will flag that for us, and we'll be able to have a conversation if there are any questions. So once you're in that pre-screen form, you're able to go through and you can save it as a draft at any time if you'd like. And then once that's done, you can hit Mark Complete. And from there, you'll see there's a Submit button. And it's really important that you make sure to hit that Submit button because we won't get your pre-screen application until you do. So please make sure to hit Submit, and then we'll receive that pre-screen for our review. And once that's done, you'll be notified once it's submitted, and you'll see here, it'll show you that that's been submitted to. So here's what it looks like on your homepage in the portal once that's been submitted. So after it is approved, you'll be notified by us that your pre-screen is approved and your status in the portal will change to payment outstanding, and you'll receive an invoice. So you can view your invoice in the portal as well by clicking view under payment information. And here you'll see that there you must complete your payment before you can access the full application, and you can just click that link to go into the PayPal invoice, and you should also receive a separate email from PayPal as well. So once you've paid that invoice, your status here will change to paid after the payment's complete, and now you'll have full access to your application. And here that is again there, you can see it says full application intake, and you'll be able to go from there. And then you'll be able to open the application. And then once you're in the application, again, very similar to pre-screen, you'll be able to save draft. So you can make edits, exit out, just make sure you hit save draft before you do. And once you're done making edits and ready to submit, hit mark complete. And again, similar to pre-screen, please make sure you select the green submit button, which will send us a notification that that application has been submitted, and then we will begin our review process. And you'll see that here when you go to that main page, you'll see the status of your application. It'll reflect that there. So again, CORES staff will review your application and get back to you with any questions via email if we have any that come up. If you ever accidentally submit your application before you're ready, please make sure to let us know and we'll work with you to get that fixed. So that's it. So now that we've reviewed the portal process, we'd like to open up the conversation for any questions from you all. Please ask your questions using the Q&A function. We also have some questions here that some of these we've already answered throughout our conversation. But we will take note of these and any additional questions that you have and try and create an FAQ document for you all that we'll post on the website as well. So I'll pause there.
So we had one question that already came through, and as we're answering this, feel free to type in any other questions that you all are thinking about. The question had to do with if you have more than one CORES certified site, can you, in the second set of foundation documents can you use another set of documents from a CORES certified site? So I think this might be blending CORES certification and perhaps the ERS property level application that if you're using Fannie Mae financing, you have to do. And obviously there's a relationship. The ERS property level application is aligned to CORES and uses many of these same tools. So for CORES, what we're asking for is that the organization use that property that you used in your initial application and that you update all of the relevant documents for that one. And then you pick another property from your portfolio. You may choose to use a property that is part of, if you have multiple properties that are financed with Fannie Mae using the ERS program, you may choose to feature those two properties or two of those properties. But you are under no obligation to. You can pick whichever other property you think does a good job of representing your process. The idea with the example properties here is that an organization is demonstrating sort of what a typical tool or process looks like for them. And so you're picking two properties to exemplify this. You're saying that as an organization, this is what your process typically looks like in the places in your portfolio where you have the most robust levels of service coordination. Hopefully I answered that question.
And
Nina,
I think
anything else you would add?
Just to double check that they're not mistaking the Fannie Mae ERS certification for CORES certification. So CORES certification is the organization level certification. So that applies to all of your properties, that applies to the organization as a whole. And the ERS is a property level certification. So that's separate from your CORES recertification process. Oh, you're muted, Alexandra.
I was just saying, we got a response saying that we answered the question, so great. We'll give it another couple minutes to see if there are other questions. People feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and put a number of links that you probably are all familiar with, but in case these are normal places to get information from us. All right. Well, it sounds like we seem to have answered all of your questions, at least for the time being. As you're, oh, here comes one. All right. The links that they will be part of the presentation in the recording, correct, Mina? The question.
Yeah, we can include those in the recording, and we'll send a follow-up email as well to you all with the recording and slides, and I can include those links in there too.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all.
Oh, it looks like there's another question.
Okay.
Do you anticipate any additional changes for this process for 2024?
No, we do not anticipate any changes. That we expect that this process will look the same. If for any reason we encounter something where it's, you know, with the rollout of the recertification and the first group of organizations that will go through the recertification process will start this summer. There may be something that we learn needs to be adjusted, in which case we would communicate and flag any changes, but sort of the substantive requirements and format, that should all remain the same. Good question. Give it just another minute. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. You have our contact information as you begin to work, review your past application and work through this process. Of course, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll be sending out recording materials and links following this webinar probably in the next couple of days. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.